is up, homebrewed Christianity listeners? This is Trip, and it is time to nerd out with your geek out, because Bruce Rogers-Vaughn is back on the podcast. That's right. He is not just a scholar of religion, not just a therapist who spent thousands of hours working with people individually, but he's someone that brings a larger picture of the pressures and anxieties our current economic system brings to the individual and to the community as a whole. In this conversation, we talk about that our current predicament. We talk about the pastoral task, the congregational challenges, and wrestle with ways to just diagnose this moment and the rise of pressure and anxiety and such. This growingly ubiquitous in culture. Before we jump into this, I just want you all to know this was a little special visit to our current reading group that is going on, the Capital Change Reading Group with Jorg Rieger. Jorg and I have been going through a theological critique of economy, looking at alternative economic systems and how, as individuals and as communities and communities of faith, and we can organize and bound together to have more thriving, equitable, and life-giving relations. If you want to join that reading group, get access to everything that's already happened, then all you got to do is go to mammonorgod.com. mammonorgod.com. It is an open online class. You can donate anything you want, including $0 or $1 million, no more. And you can get all 6 sessions. You'll get to interact in video and in audio. You'll get to interact with some amazing people in the Facebook group. And on top of all that, you can send questions for our next big special guest, the last special guest of the class, Richard Wolff, the economist. If you don't know who he is, then you'll find out. But if you do, then you're going to be like, oh, that's awesome. So yeah, check it out, mammonorgod.com. And with that, I hope you have fun as Bruce and I talk. And if you enjoy it, if you really enjoy it, then share the brew. Here you go. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and visiting our current homebrewed reading group, Capital Change, and returning to the Homebrewed Christianity podcast is the one and only Bruce Rogers-Vaughn. How are you doing today, Bruce?
Doing well here in Tennessee, and I hope things are okay there in Scotland for you. It's good to see you again.
Oh yeah, no, I'm excited to talk to you now. In the group and in and since the last time you were in the podcast, we've continued to grow. So there's going to be plenty of people who won't have heard our previous conversation. So and it'll be new to you. So maybe you could briefly introduce how it is you bring together a whole number of threads, both being a person of faith that grew up in the Deep South. You have that religious background. You tried to bring it into a context where you're committed as a scholar, reflecting on our current economic crisis and the questions that come there that we've been talking about in the class and such. But most importantly, your insights and the framework for thinking it come as someone very committed to pastoral counseling and in the types of relationships people have in the counseling context, and what you can learn on the ground in those one-on-one situations. So maybe give an kind of a picture of who you are, and then the place from which you bring so many of the different ideas we've discussed in the abstract. You find them in the one-on-one conversations in your office.
Sure, absolutely. And I think you began to name some of it, Trip. And at the beginning of the book, I named these different streams that took me to where I am today. I had no idea, even 15 years ago or 10 years ago, that a boy who grew up in Southern Appalachia as a Southern Baptist, out in the country in these rural churches. My maternal grandfather, was an illiterate farmer preacher. And so, this was so far out in the sticks, we didn't know what a fundamentalist was. If we were called a fundamentalist, we would have known what that was. So we were just Baptists, Bible-believing Baptists. And I grew up there in Southern Appalachia, outside of Fort Payne, Alabama. So that's still deep in my bones, a respect for people who are just struggling through life, encountering heartaches, trying to have families and communities and churches amidst the obstacles of the world. That's one stream. My father, neither of my parents had opportunity to finish high school. My father was a working class guy his whole life. Worked on an assembly line for General Electric for 40 years, was a member of a union, but was also a pastor of a Baptist church on the weekends. So at one point I had my 13-year pin of perfect attendance in Sunday school when I was in elementary school through high school, I guess it was. So that's all part of my background. Another part that you mentioned is after I finished my education, I became a pastoral counselor, psychotherapist, and have been doing that since the 80s. I calculated at one point that I've had over 30,000 counseling sessions with people during my career. And I've saw changes happen over that period of time from the 80s to the present in the people who came and talked to me. I didn't notice for a while, but then after about 15 or 20 years, it became apparent to me that there was something different happening. People were coming with more difficult to describe depressions. They didn't know why they were depressed. They didn't know why their anxiety was uncontrollable. People were becoming addicted to various things in much higher numbers. So this was happening all the while that brain science was supposedly getting better. Pharmacological agents were improving. Billions and billions of dollars just in the United States were being put into treatments for depression, for example. And all the while, the graphics on depression were worsening exponentially. So whatever we were doing was not working. So my experience as a clinician is certainly part of it. And then I've had a foot in the academy this whole time, so that kept me reading things. And the things I began to read began to slap up against the things I was encountering in my clinical practice. Until one summer, I read a book by Bruce Alexander. The title of the book was The Globalization of Addiction. And the subtitle was A Study in Poverty of Spirit. Now, this was a psychologist in Vancouver, Canada, who claimed to be an atheist, who was learning from Jesus. So I had to read this book. But the thesis of the book completely turned on all the light bulbs for me. It just suddenly made sense, because he was writing about how capitalism in its neoliberal phase was psychologically, interpersonally, and communally dislocating people. He called it psychosocial dislocation. And that wherever this had occurred in history, people became miserable, they became addicted, they became depressed, etc., by the millions. And he thought that there was no engine of history that was more efficient at doing this than neoliberal capitalism was, because it's global. It reaches all ends of the earth, and it is pervasive. So this made complete sense to me and set me on the road to reading in a lot of detail works that I thought I would never read. Not so much Karl Marx directly, but a lot of Marxist revisionists, but also critical race theory,
Yeah.
queer theory, and a ton of other things to try to wrap my head around what was this big social structure that people were calling neoliberalism.
Mm-hmm.
So the title of the book was Caring for Souls in a Neoliberal Age, trying to understand exactly how neoliberalism had changed things all the way to the ground, right down to the individual psyche. Changed what we thought it meant to be a human being, actually.
Yeah. You know, one of the questions that people in the reading group asked when I mentioned talking to you was, you know, give an example, a couple examples of what it sounds like in the counseling context, where the normal framework that, you know, is approved by counseling agencies and the assumptions you bring in as if the problem is always, you know, in the individual, in there to remedy, like, how does the bigger social, cultural, economic reflection reshape the counseling moment? It is such like what are some of those stories or examples where you need a bigger explanatory answer, because the individual is not going to be, doesn't have the resources for their complete salvation of sorts.
Right. One thing that I began to notice happening over the course of those years, and this is certainly true today, one way that looks like in the counseling office is people come in my office typically already having diagnosed themselves. They've read about it online, they've talked about it with friends, and I'll say, like, what brings you here? And they'll say, well, I have major depression, and I've tried a few things. I've exercised, I've watched my diet, I've even taken a little Zoloft, talking to my doctor. Nothing seems to be helping very much. And then here's the critical move that happens. At some point in telling me what they've done and what's not worked, they begin, you hear statements like, I just don't know what's wrong with me. You hear statements where, in effect, they take complete responsibility, 100%, for being depressed. It must be something about me. It's either in my genetics, it's in, you know, my distant family relationships growing up, which of course can be an influence on depression. But as over time during the therapy, we would run through these things, we would find things that made sense, but were not fully explanatory for the degree of the depression the person was grappling with. And so over time, I've learned to begin to ask people, well, tell me about your relationships. Where do you have a sense of belonging in your life? The vast majority of people could name almost nothing beyond their immediate family or community organization, but they were in the minority usually. In short, people are more lonely than they've ever been. And that's another way that this is showing up in the counseling room, is people start, even when they don't use psychobabble language like they're depressed, they'll start talking about how incredibly lonely they are. And by the way, sidebar, this fits a study that was funded by Cigna Healthcare just a couple of years ago on loneliness in the United States. This was done by Ipsos Research Group. This was a huge study, like 20,000 people in the United States were surveyed and interviewed. And it was discovered that over half of the people, probably in the United States, are lonely always or sometimes. And what really flummoxed the researchers is that when they graded this out by age groups, the younger you were, the more likely you were to be lonely. This is counterintuitive for us. We usually think of people who are elderly or people in nursing homes and retirement facilities as being lonely. Indeed, some are. But actually, teenagers were the loneliest group of people in the study. So I'm a little getting off track from your question, Trip, but loneliness is a huge indicator. And when you look at how what neoliberalism does to culture, not just the economics of it, but what it does is it reduces everything to individuals. It isolates people. We all live in our own little iron cages, so to speak. Weber's iron cage. We all live in solitary confinement to some degree, more than we used to. So it should be no surprise to us that we're getting sick in larger numbers. Depression, addiction, and so on. So there's the ways that it shows up in the counseling room are very subtle, but usually come out through self-blame, descriptions of being lonely, even being lonely in a crowd of people. You know, so
I mean, when you say that, there are two thoughts that come up, and maybe I'll say them and you respond whichever way you want. One is, prior to COVID and everything, our science tells a story of progress, right? Like understanding the human situation, the cultural, social, economic predicament. We have a progress narrative about mastery of nature. And that includes psychological well-being, right? Like the field itself isn't even that old.
no.
And yet the psychological sciences, the brain sciences, the medical, chemical, resources to use for it has gotten better. But one of the things that struck me, and you talk about this in the book and you've mentioned it, is that the self-reported situation is worse for people. And in places where, it's not because they don't have access to psych meds or a counselor, right? Like it's that our system itself we can diagnose it a lot of ways, but that the actual lived experience of a greater percentage of people is one that reports lower psychological health and involves more dependence and use of chemical drugs and such. You have that fact, that part that you mentioned, and the other side of it that strikes me is we had a crisis of loneliness and limits of possibility prior to
before COVID.
Yeah. And now I was talking at University of Edinburgh, one of our pastoral theologians that, is very connected to counseling centers here.
Mm-hmm.
And the support structure for unemployed and things in Scotland is like 1 million times better than the United States, right? Like there's not a discussion about, like if you're out of your job, you got the businesses got 80% of their full funding to keep everyone employed. You're not going to have like in America, millions of people with back rent unable to pay because they got a $1,600 check in the,
right.
It's way better. And I'd rather be anything other than the top 10% in the UK than in America. But the numbers on the waiting list in a country that has universal health care and funds psych care, like every one of our students who's in the process of doctoral work and pastoral counseling has got like a giant wait list. They're capping the number of times individuals can talk to somebody because everybody's overworked. You have retired ministers coming out of retirement just to get on phone calls with people who are lonely and then wanting to know, like, we already had all these crappy conditions trying to make sense of life as essentially the generations under the boomers felt all this pressure. And then this happens and like WTF, right?
Yes.
And I know members in this class that are ministers have had people asking these questions. I know individuals in this class who've done funerals for people that committed suicide or had been part of interventions. Like, I don't know the nice way of asking this, but like, if we can't think that this moment is revelatory of a deep demonic problem at the heart of the way we relate in our community and the fabric of it, then like, when would we? Like, how do you see those? Those are two really big issues that showed up so many questions that I just feel like they're overwhelming to even say, right?
Right. The COVID pandemic just peeled back the curtain to show us what reality is really like. So since my book came out, things are, I think, much more clear to more people now than they were when my book came out. Because, we already had a social structure, neoliberalism around the world, including in the UK. I mean, the UK and the United States were kind of where it started happening first, as far as neoliberal capitalism is concerned. So it already had people sort of semi-isolated and more lonely than they ever were before. Then you add COVID on top of it, literally isolating, quarantining people in their homes, only able to get in contact over Zoom or a phone call or a text. Yes, it just made it exponentially worse. And so given the ground was already fertile that neoliberalism had laid, COVID was a nuclear bomb dropped on the thing. It's just made everything that was true then far more true today, including economic inequality. Economic inequality is far worse since March of last year, 2020, than it was then, and it was already terrible. The racism that's implicit in neoliberal culture, need I say more? I mean, what we've seen with police violence, police on Black violence in the United States, but not only that, the attack upon Black communities through debt, predatory debt and other instruments have probably cost more lives even than police on Black violence have cost. So, I mean, racism has been part of the lifeblood of capitalism since it began, as Cedric J. Robinson and many people have shown. And in neoliberal capitalism, it's just on the front page again in spades. So, I mean, in terms of economic inequality, how do you make sense of in the United States, and this has been replicated in the UK and around the world, how do you make sense in the United States that 10, 15 million people were out of work because of the pandemic? The economy still is tanked. It's showing some signs of improvement, but it is still, I can't use that kind of language on this podcast. It's still in a horrible place. But look at what Wall Street is doing.
It's less than optimal.
It's less than optimal. Meanwhile, Wall Street is going gangbusters. I mean, we're way over, 30,000 points now on the stock exchange. Why is that? Because the influx, the pumping of money into the economy by the Federal Reserve and commercial banks has all gone to the top. It's all gone to the investor class. They've got to spend this money somewhere, Trip. And what are they going to do with it? they're going to buy government bonds, they're going to buy corporate bonds, and all this stuff is traded on Wall Street.
Yeah, it's one of those moments where I find it odd that every time people near me or just associated with me on social media say things like Joseph Biden's like a radical leftist socialist, I'm like, no, if you borrow money to do like the bare minimal response to a crisis, then the 1% not only makes money because they are the ones that lend the money to the government, but they're also the companies that are then given that money to build whatever it is or for the research or whatever. Like they're on like the double take. The whole reason that you borrow the money is because you live in a society that doesn't demand the type of relational reciprocal justice where the community cares for itself in equitable means. And so in lieu of, I don't know, asking Jeff Bezos to pay as much taxes as you and I did this past year, and Amazon to pay anything, and for Apple not to use Ireland as a way to escape paying, like as opposed to avoid, like, I don't know, bare minimal responsibility that we expect our children to do when it goes to being part of a family, we will just borrow it from those same people, pay it back to them with interest, and then give them that money and call Joe Biden a leftist. That is just nuts. Yes. And since you self-edited, I've decided to as well. So can I got a stack of questions that were from ministers that involved it's maybe before even like asking the specific ones. One of the difficulties, right, in something like what we've been doing in this class, what you do in your layout in your book, is that as you become more aware of the larger systemic powers at work, and then you yourself, your family and friends, people you meet in your parish, you see that their lives are being chewed up by a system that could not care. You realize you don't necessarily have the agency to do anything about it in the moment. And yet, as a friend, as a family member, as ordained clergy in a congregation or a faith leader, you want to show up in some way to be a blessing, right? And when you've lost your job and you're depressed, or when two parents can't figure out how to pay their bills, it's horrible for their own relationship and such. And then all this pressure shows up in their kids' life, and then they show up asking about their kids' bad grades. And you're like, no, you're all are getting squeezed by a system that does not care about you. But you're like, well, at least we got Donald Trump, right? Like there are all these different ways, like these pressures show up. Like how would you frame the task of being a pastor who both attends to the big systemic questions, but also shows up in the lives of people who may not be aware that they're not ultimately responsible for a lot of the situations, but wants to use what they are responsible for, that little bit of agency towards the good?
Yes. Well, I think churches, and I'll speak about Christian churches since I'm a Christian minister. This is translatable in other ways, in other locales, in other religious groups. But as a Christian, I think there's a lot of talk today about anti-capitalism. More and more people realize capitalism is a problem. And it's not just the so-called leftist Marxists that are realizing this. I mean, Joseph Stiglitz and Robert Reich and all kinds of other people who were big pro-capitalists back in their day realized capitalism is a problem. So here's the deal. It happens to be a sort of pushback against capitalism to genuinely love and care for people. All right. especially when we're doing it in an organized way. I mean, any actual love, and by love, I'm not talking about romantic love. I'm talking about sort of what we learned in seminary, the theological sense of that word, the ethical sense of that word, to treat people with compassion and respect is against the market, so to speak. It's to value people not just as an ends to production or to profit, but in and of themselves. So, Tripp, there's actually a line of connection between ministers and people who are trying to intervene at the systems level and at the political level and the social level, and also intervening, at the bedsides of sick people and in the homes of people who are hurting. There's a direct line of connection between those. It's not like we're taking off one hat and putting on another. It's love all the way down when it comes to trying to push back against unjust systems, such as neoliberal capitalism is an unjust system. But in some ways, as Nancy Fraser has pointed out, and there's just no better theoretician than Nancy Fraser right now on understanding what capitalism, neoliberal capitalism is. She says capitalism has always depended on, in order to do its thing, it's depended on people. She calls it the front story and the back story. So the front story of capitalism is everything we've always heard: private property, free markets, the wage, the owner-worker relationship, etc. The backstory is somebody's got to raise kids back home. Somebody's got to take care of the elderly. These acts of care that go. Capitalism has always depended on that in order to exist. So there's this dependency capitalism has on care. So we do have to watch it. What I just said is true, but we have to add more to it. We can't just sort of take care of everything so capitalism can continue to screw us, right? So we've got to expand our love to include not just the household and not just the congregation, but the world. I mean, doesn't the Bible say, "For God so loved the world that he gave us"? So we can't detach the love of our family, the love of our intimates, the love of our community, all of which is great. And the love that is there is off the market. I'll insist that that's still the case. But still, capitalism can feed off of that to continue its rapacious existence. If we're taking care of everything it's refusing to take care of. So what we need is to expand that love out into the cultural and the political spaces that we occupy, and insist that corporations be ethical, insist that government be caring, and so forth. So it's all connected. We just have to expand the love out. I mean, I think Jesus was about changing the world, not just individual hearts.
So when part of that movement of expansion is something, people in a counseling context, ministers and stuff, all are constantly wrestling with. Part of it is that we regularly have a blindness towards part of the relationships we're engaged in, right? So, and sometimes like the ways in which we're engaged in certain relationships. So in America, people could say like, well, if I'm a good member of my family, a good worker at my job, faithful member in my community of faith, a good neighbor, these type of things, then I'm winning. I voted, right? And that kind of thing. In our particular context now, ever since the advent of money, there's been a growing network of relationships where, because of how money functions as a passively assented to fiction that binds it to certain character and nature of relations and internalize certain assumptions, right? Like more and more of our life gets conscripted into a particular network of relationships, ones we aren't attentive to the same way when you lock eye contact with your neighbor or even someone you're fighting with in you're looking at.
Right.
There becomes a vessel through the monetization of relationships, and that we are regularly engaged in a whole host of relations that we're unexamined in a sense about their character. And the easiest example is the environment, in the sense that there is no economic variable for the output, the negative ecological cost to people from our patterns of consumption, necessity of growth and things. But and we've talked about this quite a bit in the class, like even the way the World Bank and International Monetary Fund and all these type of things function, do the same thing. As someone who spends time like pushing that growth of awareness for how you're related and connected, to take ownership of agency, say as someone wrestling with how to be a better parent in their home or a leader in their community and such, and you're helping them try to own the way they're connected. Are there things we can gain from that in the interpersonal level to then help us think through, as people of faith committed to a much more justice-filled, peace-seeking vision of relationships, to then deal with those ways we're related, where there is this monetary or digital or political mediation that happens that depersonalizes it? Does that make sense? How I framed it?
It absolutely makes sense. And the first thing that came to my mind was the quotation from the Gospels where Jesus says, I say to you, love your enemy, bless them who curse you. So we've romanticized love, and I don't mean just for romantic relation, but we've sentimentalized it, we might say. We've sentimentalized love to mean something we experience with our intimates, our spouses, our children, our parents, our close friends, maybe some of our working colleagues, not all of them, but some of them, we would say that we love. This is not what love meant in the Gospels. When Jesus says love your enemy, he must be talking about something else. He's talking about expanding our hearts outside those bounds of intimacy to the world at large. And oddly enough, you put your finger on one of those forms. Money is a form. Money is not a thing. Money is a social process between people. And how we treat money, how money is created, how it is circulated, and how it is maintained, and whose interest does it serve, is all about whether we live in a loving world or a loveless world. Am I responding to your
No. I think it's I don't know. So often, relationships you would never put in a category called stewardship, right? Like something you manage, and like Wesley's like, make all you can, save all you can, give all you can. Like you would never even use that language when it goes to people. And I wonder, like, if that's kind of what you're getting at, in the sense that because it's money, then it involves a type of distancing,
right?
Where you're, you're unaware of the way people are tied up into the system. But just thinking about, the last year, I think a whole lot more people, because of the coronavirus and lockdown, because of the visibility of George Floyd's murder, and things, realize just how much how many people our current institutional and structural assessment or system has, like, actually has labeled as expendable.
Yes.
And what do you do with that? Like, okay, here's a good example. I was talking with a friend of mine who's I'm trying to decide since this is on the internet, but okay, he is a very prominent leader of the Black church, and we've been friends since divinity school. And I messaged him about something, and then it led to like catching up conversation. Oh, well, let's hop on FaceTime kind of thing. Like where we realized we haven't talked. We've just mostly like, if one of us needed help with something or that kind of thing. And like, we're catching up. And he was like, Tripp, I know you talk to a lot of white ministers. Like, how are they doing? Like, and I start to like share, cause I've been doing all these reading groups and like, I'm blah, 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 blah. And he goes, yeah, he's like, I don't think y'all know how to handle it. And I was like, what? Well, knowing that the lie you have to pretend you believe just to get through the week doesn't care about you. Like, you're real disappointed and torn up about this, aren't you? Right. And I remember going like, oh no, I think you just named it. And it reframed the way I heard lots of conversations with other people, like younger than boomers who thought straight white men and some women of like, but with like the type of background and privilege, you think like, I'm going to do these things. I'm going to do good at it. I'm like working at this. I should succeed. Like, I mean, I never know exactly how I'm going to succeed, but I know the minimal. I know the base that it like what is not doing good is still better than what is happening to me right now.
Right.
And I would not have done all these other things, like everything that I did to get to this point, if I didn't get these perks. Right. And it was this powerful conversation where I realized that, while we were in grad school together, his experience is like, oh man, I'm the first person in my family to be here. I'm going to, this, in scare quotes, prestigious school in the South, like, and I'm going to be working hard, like he has like a very different story in his head. Like, I'm like, well, I got to get these grades to then go to a PhD program, and then I'm going to do these things. Right. And he's like, you had a rug under you that got pulled out, just like a whole lot of people in your situation. And now you're like bitter and going, huh? And it was after it got pulled out that the George Floyd situation made you go, no, this is really not cool. This is bad. Right? Does that make sense? Like, after that conversation, I like reheard so many conversations with people in messages from this group, other reading groups over the last year that made me go, yeah, I think this is they're like, his observation is really on point.
Yeah. So what went through my head is, since I wrote the book, actually around the time the book came out, I proposed and started teaching a class at Vanderbilt Divinity School that was titled Race and Class, Cultivating Radical Care. So the whole course was focused on looking at how race and class are related to each other and how that should matter to ministers, how that should matter to people who are striving for social justice. Because, we've been fed a line in the United States that it's race or class, that this is some sort of dichotomy. They've always been tangled up together. So what went through my mind when you were telling this story about your friend is, I've said to my students once or twice, white supremacy is shrinking in terms of the number of people it really is benefiting. Now, this does not mean, let me hasten to say, this does not mean that white supremacy is still not hung out as an ideal for working class white people to get them to buy in, right? To preserve the elite order. That is still happening. But when you mentioned the rug being pulled out from under us, and then we're talking to people who never had a rug under them to begin with. And no wonder he's talking to you and going, now you see what it feels like, right? Right? You're beginning to get it, right? I think that's what your friend was saying to you. And the thing is, so Nancy Fraser has this point. I talked about her front story and back story of capitalism. The front story, capitalism takes advantage of people by exploitation. And this is what Marx talked about a lot. Exploitation. What did he mean by that? He meant the wage earner relationship. So people freely sell their labor as free citizens, but there's surplus value. So the owner of the means of production is raking profit off the top at the expense of the worker, right? That's exploitation. But the backstory, she said, is expropriation. And what expropriation means is you're simply robbed. You're not paid at all, or you're enslaved, or you're simply cast aside as disposables. That's what happens. That's what white supremacy does. It creates millions of disposable people. And neoliberal capitalism does it more efficiently, for Christ's sake, even than industrial capitalism did. It denies racism while doing it more efficiently than ever. So, but here's the difference, and your friend is pointing to when he points at you as a white guy, right? Now, lots of white people are being treated as disposable, and they're starting to get it, that they don't really matter. They're not really needed for production or consumption. They're a non-entity, right? So no wonder your black pastor friend is saying, now you see what we've been talking about. So that's what I mean when I say to my students, white supremacy is shrinking. James Baldwin famously said, when I talk about white supremacy, I'm talking about Chase Manhattan Bank. He's saying what I'm saying, that white supremacy is most symbolized in the boardroom of corporations and in the meeting rooms of large banks. That's where the seed of white supremacy. It doesn't mean that I, as a white man, don't have white privilege. Don't misunderstand me. I'm much least likely to be shot down unarmed by a police officer. That's right. So, but white supremacy in terms of elite power, that's something now that's causing lots of not only African Americans and people of color, but a significant percentage of white people. Mm-hmm. So I had a student this semester who wrote his senior thesis on Appalachia. He was from Appalachia. And he wrote about how neoliberalism is dispossessing Appalachia, mountaintop removal, extraction. Well, now we're talking about not exploitation, we're talking about expropriation, simply stealing from people, in this case, in Appalachia. So, it's happening and has been happening in Appalachia for years. We just haven't talked about it in the open very much. Instead, we accuse them of being rednecks and hillbillies and ridicule them, when all along they've been victims of expropriation. Right?
That's really important. And all right, so I have two more questions I want to make sure we get to. The first one was someone that has listened to our previous podcast, which I'll reshare everyone in the group so you can find it. But he asked, how did Bruce interpret, since the last podcast, the election season leading all the way up to the storming of the Capitol? Right, yeah. As someone who is from the South, like from white, Southern evangelical Christianity, sees them in the counseling room for, years, and has the structural, critical, macro tools. Like, what takes on it were really wrong, and like, what did you think we really should learn from this type of experience?
Wonderful question. So let me first frame it, and then I'll try to respond to the question. I want to frame it using Nancy Fraser again. I'm talking lots of Fraser today. So she has a wonderful little book that came out just a year or so ago. I think it was published by Verso, called "The Old is Dying and the New Cannot Be Born," which is actually a quote from Antonio Gramsci. But the subtitle is something like, well, actually, I have it here on the shelf. I can tell you what the subtitle is. Sorry for the pause. The subtitle is "From Progressive Neoliberalism to Trump and Beyond." So she lays it out very well in this book. What we've got in the United States today is neoliberalism all over. So in the Democrat Party and so-called progressives and the liberals, the libtards, they're progressive neoliberals. And what does she mean by progressive neoliberals? Progressive neoliberals, she says, is a marriage between social progressives who are against racism, against patriarchy, they're pro-GLBTQ rights, etc. So that's me. That's a lot of us progressives, except it's wed to the values of institutions in Silicon Valley. So what it doesn't do is criticize capitalism. It doesn't name the beast. It instead focuses simply on oppressions by identity, which need to be opposed for sure. But it doesn't tie to so it doesn't do any structural change. It just tries to get people to be kinder to each other, sort of at an attitudinal, psychological, interpersonal level. That's progressive neoliberalism, and most of the Democrat Party, I should add. On the other side, she says we have reactionary neoliberalism. This is Trumpism. This is the form that it took in the United States that we call, and in the UK, it was Brexit. In the United States, it was Trump. What is reactionary neoliberalism? I'll put it in my own words. Reactionary neoliberalism is where the same thing, all the money goes to the top. The whole structure is built to increase inequality, take from workers and the poor and give to rich people. Same story as on progressive neoliberalism. But under reactionary neoliberalism, somebody has figured out something the F is wrong here. They don't know what it is, but someone is screwing us over. And we're mad and we're not going to take it anymore. In other words, they become reactionary. So what feeds that beast? All the old stuff. Racism, misogyny, you name it. Creating bad guys. The immigrants at the border. Right? Same thing, the same story in Brexit, same story in parts of nations in Europe. You know, he started expelling immigrants and making it harder for people to come in the country. So that's how I would frame it, is when you go to vote today in the United States, you're going to vote for a neoliberal. They're either going to be a progressive neoliberal or they're going to be a reactionary neoliberal, but they're going to be a neoliberal. Now, here's how I think of my Trump friends. And, you know, my family back in Alabama voted for Trump. So here's how I try to talk to people who voted for Trump. I try to say, look, you're right. The whole system is screwing us over. The government is screwing us over, but also corporations are screwing us over. The banks are screwing us over. We're not doing as well as we used to. We can't afford health insurance. We're one illness away from bankruptcy. Even the middle class is an illness away from bankruptcy. So your feelings are in the right place, but you've named the wrong enemies. You've been sucker punched. Somebody has persuaded you that blacks, that minorities, that immigrants and lazy people and so forth are the problem. That's how I talk to them. you can't just rage against Trump voters and call them a basket of deplorables, like Hillary Clinton did. You're just going to get more of them turning out to vote for Trump when you do that. And, Trump is unimportant here. If we don't have Trump, it'll be the next person. I mean, the movement is not dead. So we've got to hook into the affects that people have, that something is really wrong, and do some talking, just plain communicating about who's suffering and why. And, they got more in common with Blacks who are suffering and Hispanics who are suffering than they know they do. I'm talking about the so-called white working class.
Yeah, it is. I don't know. I mean, there's a number of follow-up questions like that I'd like to ask, but I know we're running out of time. So, but like just even around that. So I'll skip the next question. But so when we recognize that the system is doing two things, one, it's giving you two options that you then pit against each other tribally, which are culturally divergent, but systemically, they're functioning in pretty similar ways, right? Like that they're both deeply neoliberal when it goes to fidelity to the kind of global system.
Their loyalties are still with the banks and corporations.
Right. And you can see that even playing out in the way that the Republican Party is trying to figure out what to do with the fact that there are so many people in it that aren't even sure they even want to pretend to be democratic in like support democracy anymore because they're so bitter culturally. Right. Like you see something like that. And then you see, like Clyburn. The guy takes so much money from pharmaceutical companies. It drives me up a wall that he gets counted as a progressive. Brings in the most money from pharmaceutical companies of all of Congress, and was part of Obama's strategic let's rally, get all the.
We lost contact there for a moment.
Yeah, I'm not sure it happened. Like everything just turned off and on.
Something's bombing your basement.
Yeah, and so I'm not exactly sure when it cut out, but what I was saying was, the short version is, our two political parties in America have the same engine, neoliberal economic order. They have different cultural expressions. But the neoliberal order is trying to gauge which one do we need to lean into to have the most influence. So like,
right.
Like right now you have a bunch of Trump fans going like, actually, we would like to rig elections and do white identity politics and all this kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden companies that have never like gone public to be like, we actually like the Democrats do, because what they really need is just enough stability to screw over most of the people so that they can then harness the power of America to screw over the rest of the world for their own agenda. And like when you're in a system like that and then get, the whole January 6th expression, it's real hard to recognize that at least part of where that anger and animus comes from is, one, the systemic class issues around the poor ubiquitously, like your family in Appalachia, all that kind of thing. And some of them, they're just like completely uninterested in letting America be something other than run by white guys.
Right.
And we'd rather it just not be democratic. And I feel like that tension of class analysis and the way the two-party system with one real leader affects everyone then is using the identity politics issues to set us against each other. But
right.
It's not as if white supremacy is still not an issue, or xenophobia is not an issue. It's like, how do you see those things working out, and not just at the macro level, but for faith leaders who, especially in this group, are going to be ones that are probably more inclusive on identity politics issues and
Right.
wanting to be more invested on, economic ones. Like, how would you advise us to engage those issues in ways that don't create more animus, but it invites people to deeper solidarity?
Yes. So let me commend, I was listening to NPR a few weeks ago and was listening to an interview, and I'm going to blank on her name, Annie DeFranco. You may have heard of Annie DeFranco, the musician. She had a new album come out called Revolutionary Love. And in the interview, she was being asked about what she means by revolutionary love. And the interviewer said, "You mean we're supposed to love people that stormed the Capitol on January the 6th? And she said, yes. She said, revolutionary love is love for your opponent. That's revolutionary love. And the interviewer just quickly said, well, this sounds like, love your enemy. And she laughed and said, yes. But there's a wonderful line in that song that says, tell me your story and I'll hold it in my hand. So she says, if we could sit people down that stormed the Capitol, she said, and if you could understand people's story about how they get to where they are, you still won't agree with what they did or what they're, trying to promote. But if you understand the human story, there's at least a gap across which you can talk. I think that's true. Now, it may not be true universally, but speaking in the large sense, I think that's true. And look, Tripp, my students, probably people listening to your podcast, think about neoliberalism and this huge system. Doesn't matter who you vote for, you're still going to get screwed and all that. And people start feeling hopeless. But look, this system may be resilient, but it is also very fragile. Change can happen, and no system will last forever. The question we have in front of us today, all of us as human beings, and as Christian believers, I think we feel an ethical responsibility toward the earth, the environment, fellow human beings. The question is whether we can change it before we burn the earth up, right? So we're pressed against time here. We've got to have some change quickly. But the system is fragile, and it's a house of cards, actually. But we don't need to be fooling ourselves, though, that it's going to be simple to take it down. But what can change it? Movements can change it. Mm-hmm. Look at Joe Biden. Joe Biden is a moderate, quote, Democrat, neoliberal Democrat, if there was ever a neoliberal Democrat. Not that much distance between him and Hillary Clinton. I mean, they're part of the so-called Democratic establishment. But somebody's got Joe Biden's attention. Look at the stimulus bill that was just passed. It didn't go just to rich people. Checks went out to people who actually needed checks, and not just checks, but other kinds of support went out. Health insurance was made more affordable to a lot of families, and so forth. So people have got Joe Biden's ear, and it's because he sees that something is changing in society. Black Lives Matter has been ridiculed by many in the media, on the right in particular, but probably is a movement that has done more to change our country right now than any other single movement. And it is at root an anti-capitalist movement. The statement written by the leaders of the movement for Black Lives says, capitalism is racist. They call it racial capitalism. They use Cedric J. Robinson's term. So if we fight against racism, we're also fighting against capitalism.
Yeah.
But we're also finding allies in other places that we didn't expect, when a lot of working white people are starting to get the idea. So we need not despair, in other words.
Mm-hmm.
Cast down, but not in despair, as the old saying goes.
Yeah. So, maybe we could end by you letting people know where they can find you, connect with you and such online, because I know you've been working hard on cultivating website and stuff for public platform and future engagement.
I will do that. And as a teaser toward the next conversation for you and I to have, my research now, a lot besides racism, it's on money. And actually the two of them are merging. Economists don't understand money. Isn't that interesting? Economists don't even agree about what money is.
Yeah, well, I'm not that optimistic about economists, Bruce.
Okay, well, they don't agree about what money is.
It's like asking a Calvinist about God.
Yeah. And most people in the United States, Henry Ford Sr. once said, if people in the United States understood money and the banking system, there'd be a revolution in the street tomorrow morning. And the reason he said that is because the government doesn't create money, Trip. Money's created when you take out loans at the bank. The bank is not lending you money they have. That money got created when you signed the loan. And that's where money comes from. And the vast majority of people don't know that. In other words, all of our money is based on debt. And that's part of the system. Monetary systems don't have to be based on debt, but under neoliberal capitalism, it is. So that's a teaser for a conversation for later. And Christians should be concerned about that, because Jesus said you cannot serve God and money. So there's more in the Bible about money than there is family or sex or even life after death. So,
or the Trinity.
Or even the Trinity. Yeah. So we got to talk about money again.
Oh, yeah.
Now, in terms of where people can find me, Trip, I'll be leaving the academy the end of this semester. They can go to brucerogersvaughn.com. No hyphens, no spaces, brucerogersvaughn.com. They can find out what I'm into, and I'm going to start keeping that website up to snuff, updating it regularly to see what I'm into, and they can get in contact with me there. They can sign up to get communications from what I'm into and where I'll be talking next, and get in touch with me that way. So I welcome people to do that. And I hope that people listening to the podcast will go to the website, and because I want to get in touch with people outside of the academy, more people.
Awesome. Well, thank you for hanging out on the internet. And I'm real excited to see, what happens as you put more effort in sharing things publicly, because I think that there are quite a few people in helping professions asking questions that the framework of answers we have aren't built for answering, and they represent so many networks of people whose deep vocational commitment is to the well-being of our community, that with some with a larger analysis and cooperation could really make a difference.
And I want to go back to, in closing, I want to go back to your friend who's a minister in a black church. Our friends who are people of color, many white people are beginning to understand what they've understood for a long, long time. We need to listen to our friends of color and leaders in the Black movement, Hispanic, Latinx, GLBT folk. Identity politics can be co-opted by neoliberalism. That is true. But what once happened only to people of color are happening to all kinds of people now, including most white people. So we need to sit up and pay attention. These are not our enemies. These are our friends. Let's embrace them and support them. It's fun spending time with you, Trip.
Oh, yeah. It was great. Thank you so much.
Your trip. And take care of yourself over there in Scotland.
Oh, I will try. And, hopefully we will get to connect in person at some point once this whole thing is over.
I would love to take you out for a beer.
Well, I would like drinking it. All right. I'll talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Congratulations. You made it all the way through this episode of Homebrewed Christianity. If you love it, share it. If you want to support it, go to homebrewedcommunity.com. Join the community. Get access to all sorts of classes, a private podcast feed, and you get to go to bed every night knowing I'm part of a community bringing theology into the world. Peace.